guy's for real. He's alive. He'll talk to me. Wow.
You mean because you imagine people who write books reside in some seventh heaven, unaccessible by normal human beings?
Well, or just inundated with too much stuff to bother with, with a question about your writing. It was great. It's great stuff.
Yeah, well, it's nice to get questions. To put the greatness of writers in perspective, I'll tell you a story about the last time I dealt with my publisher at Bantam in New York. Sitting across from those people above the 50th floor, how I come off to them is, well, now let's see, Mr. McKenna, we have current sales figures in front of us. You're kind of a 60,000 copy kind of guy, aren't you? And frankly, Mr. McKenna, around here that really butters no bread. We're interested in the million-plus seller. We can carry people like you, of course, given that we have substantial successes in other fields, and on like that. To which I replied, so I guess you're not taking me to dinner at Elaine's, which was true. Not even tea. Well, is there anything out of this morning that anybody wants to take up?
Yeah, I had a question when you were talking about growing psilocybin and then, or growing the mushrooms, and it just kind of sparked something in me. Do you have a connection with the David realms, the nature spirits? Is that something that comes up for you in this work?
Well, I don't know. Is a self-transforming elf machine a deva?
What do you mean?
This is a phrase that has been associated with me for many, many years. I encounter self-transforming elf machines, which are creatures, entities, perhaps, although they're not made out of matter. They're made out of, as nearly as I can figure it out, they're made out of syntax driving light. But if what your question addresses is the issue of entities on the other side, there are definitely entities on the other side for me, and there seem to be such for many, many other people. I'm not by any standard sensitive. So if I get entities, then they are substantial and capable of defending themselves. It's one of the most challenging parts of the whole psychedelic landscape, because most people can accept the idea of disordered sensory input, recovery of traumatic memory material, so forth and so on. But what are we to do with an elf? That becomes a little harder to contextualize in psychoanalytic theory, although Jung did a good job when he said autonomous elements can escape from the psyche's control and present themselves as independent entities. I'm not sure he's ever seen a self-transforming elf machine. Are those Devic entities, do you think?
Yeah, I don't have any hallucinogenic experience. Myself, I'm more familiar with connections in nature and other experiences that people have had in Horn Group or being in the Himalayas, that kind of thing. So what you're saying is through your experiences with pharmaceuticals, you have that experience, even if you're not having it when you're not.
Oh, it's the defining characteristic of the true DMT flash. I mean, it is not subtle. These things mob you like badly trained Rottweilers. They come bounding forward by the dozens, by the hundreds. They jump into your body. They jump out of your body. And I thought, it maps to some degree over the archetype of the little people, the leprechaun, the fae, and being Irish and being Jungian. I'm willing to entertain, maybe I have a special relationship to this stuff. But then in the Amazon, the people using DMT that I studied in the early 70s, the reason they did it, they said, was to speak with the little people. What puzzles me about my contacts with these beings is it conforms to, let's say, the Irish model. They are small. They live under hills, or when you're with them, you have a sense that you are somehow underground. They are full of merriment, almost to a manic and frightening level. It's sort of like a Bugs Bunny cartoon gone berserk. They are friendly, but play rough. In other words, it's a land of explosions and falling anvils. It's like a Roadrunner cartoon or something. But the overwhelming feeling is love, but I spell it L-U-V to distinguish it from the ordinary kind, because it's just this kind of crazy, childish affection. And they're delighted to have me in their presence. Well, now that all sort of corresponds with the Irish model, or with worldwide folklore of little creatures, little people in the woods. Mm-hmm. What's happening that is not mappable onto fairyland or leprechauns or Findhornian beings or anything like that, or anything else I've ever heard of, is that these entities have an agenda. And it's a very curious agenda. They use a language which you see. It is made out of sound. In other words, it is sound, but you see it in that state. And the entire point of the encounter, from their perspective, seems to be to teach you to do this. They want you to transform your language. They want you to speak Elfish. And, what? If you've never done DMT and you just smoked it and you're 30 seconds into this experience and this is what it's come down to, you wonder what to make of it. I've thought about this for years and years and years, and I don't know why there should be an invisible syntactical intelligence giving language lessons in hyperspace, but that certainly consistently seems to be what is happening. I've thought a lot about language as a result of that, and several things about it. First of all, it is the most remarkable thing we do, I think. And we talked a little bit this morning about epigenetic behaviors. Chomsky showed that language, the deep structure of language, is under genetic control. But that's like the assembly language level. Local expressions of language are epigenetic. And it seems to me that language is some kind of enterprise of human beings that is not finished, that we have now left the grunts and the digs of the elbow somewhat in the dust, but the most articulate, brilliantly pronounced and projected English or French or German or Chinese is still a poor carrier of our intent, a very limited bandwidth for the intense compression of data that we are trying to put across to each other. And it occurs to me from studying McLuhan and other people that the ratios of the senses, the ratio between the eye and the ear and so forth, this also is not genetically fixed. There are ear cultures and there are eye cultures, print cultures and electronic cultures. So it may be that our perfection and our completion lies in the perfection and completion of the word Again, this curious theme of the word and its effort to concretize itself. A language that you can see is far less ambiguous than a language that you hear. If I read a paragraph of Proust, then we could spend the rest of the afternoon discussing what did he mean. But if we look at a piece of sculpture by Henry Moore, we can discuss what did he mean, but at a certain level there is a kind of shared bedrock that isn't in the Proust passage. We each stop at a different level with the textual passage. With the three-dimensional object, we all sort of start from the same place and then work out our interpretations. You know, is it a nude? Is it an animal? Is it bronze? Is it wood? Is it poignant? Is it comical? So forth and so on. So this is not a very scientific part of the rap, because it's very hard to convince people that there are non-human intelligences this side of Genebel Ganubi. And when you tell them that these non-human intelligences are accessed through the diminutive mushrooms growing on their front lawn, they just write you off as a squirrel. But this question of the non-human intelligences is very, very much on the agenda. All shamans in all times and places have claimed this. And the thing that so pleases me about DMT is, a lot of people will not take a psychedelic like LSD or psilocybin or something because it lasts hours and hours. Inevitably, a thing lasting that long, you're going to end up dealing with your stuff, your anxiety, your fear, your this and that. A lot of people don't care for that sort of thing. Whether that's good or bad is another issue. With DMT, it lasts 4 minutes. And so how lost in an examination of childhood trauma can you get in 4 minutes, especially when you have hundreds of elves tugging at your coat sleeves? So it's really an incredibly powerful tool. We have the UFO people claiming there are non-human intelligences, but they have no reliable method of contact that works for a skeptic. The great thing about DMT is it doesn't require belief, a quality I mentioned last night as belonging to the truth. The truth requires no belief. It is the truth. I'm sure there are probably people listening to my words at this moment who have encountered these entities. This, to my mind, is the great and chilling mystery in the center of the psychedelics. And once you've encountered these things, you have to take them seriously, to the point of you have to understand, where do they fit into the great order of being? What are these things? How can there be a life form not made of matter? In other words, how can they be intelligent and coherent but have no fixed body outline? Is the universe in fact populated by non-human, non-material intelligences that we somehow contact using drugs? I mean, that's one possibility. That's the question, yes. Where are they when you're not there? Is it an ongoing thing? Is something going on this planet? Are these the controllers? Are you getting into a back channel that weren't cleared for? Or, and this is to my mind the most chilling and appalling and exhilarating possibility of all, when you go back over the shamanism thing, you say, you shamans, now where is this all coming from? They will tell you it comes from ancestors. Well, that's a cheerful and fairly sanitized concept, but when you deconstruct it, ancestors are dead people. What is actually being suggested there is that there is a kind of ecology of souls, one energy threshold over, that is co-present with this world. Well, strangely enough, that's what the Irish myth of the Fae says. It says these are dead people. These are souls that linger in our environment, and this is what souls look like. Again, folklore is only a guide, but if what we are dabbling with, if what lies at the end of the road of shamanism is the dissolution of the boundary between life and death itself, then the million-year intuition that this was a path worth following will be dramatically vindicated. And one of the reasons I've preached DMT so furiously is I just want a larger body of people to take it so that we can compare data. We need to understand, how is this possible? It raises a whole host of questions. One is, not only how is this possible, but then given that it is possible, how has it been kept secret? How can millions of people go to the grave, raise children, hold jobs, so forth and so on, go to the grave, and the news of a doorway standing that agape hasn't penetrated? I mean, most people believe they're imprisoned in this world, and that the only hope is maybe 15 years at the ashram and hideous acts of self-abnegation and control and so forth and so on. And actually, the boundary between us and an unspeakably bizarre world, it's 30 seconds away at any time, as long as you have DMT available to smoke. That's appalling to me. I mean, it means we don't know nothing. Yeah.
You talk about trying to map your experiences onto the myths. I wonder if it's possible that you could look at the myths for information of mastery. That is, we've no longer masters of this doorway. We're trying to rediscover a mastery that's been held for thousands of years. Maybe there's something that we can find in the myths that tell us a behavior or a mode of being in that state that would be useful. For instance, catching the leprechaun and getting the pot of gold implies there's some kind of game we can play with them that yields some value.
Yeah, well, the classical myth about leprechauns is that they want to keep you. If they catch you, or if you mess with them, they'll hold you. And then you have to bargain your way out. And the bargain is always the solution of a riddle. Notice that what's happening here is it's all about linguistic prowess. It's all about poetic skill. It's all about language ability. Only the eloquent, only the clever, only those who are masters of riddlery and pun are acceptable to these entities. Apparently that's what they value. Why? I guess because they're made of language. So, and they themselves have, when I try to describe to people what they are or what they look like, various things can be said. They're like self-dribbling jeweled basketballs. In other words, they don't have faces or anything, not the little yellow leather jerkins and the curve-pointed shoes, not that. Self-dribbling jeweled basketballs, and they use the language to make objects. That's what this language, how this language is different from ordinary English. English, we can make meaning. The DMT language makes objects. It's like a higher dimensional language. And so these things bound forward with the complete purpose of delighting you. And they reach into the air, into their bodies, into some nearby invisible dimension, and they pull out what I would call words, puns, objects, hallucinations. Things which manage to be all those things simultaneously. And they say, look at this. And it's purely designed to dazzle and astound. And then a colleague will elbow the little guy aside and say, no, look at this. And they're all in front of you, chirping, clamoring. And these objects that they make begin themselves to speak and float away and reproduce. And you've arrived. 30 seconds ago, you were sitting in a room with your grubby friend somewhere pursuing spiritual understanding. Now, this is going on, and it's very hard to not be horrified. I mean, the cognitive dissonance, the neck-snapping switch of dimensions, and then after about 3, 4, 5 minutes, it retracts. It loses its vitality, and it begins to pull away from you, almost like a boat pulling away from a dock. And in fact, I had one trip where, metaphorically, not having hands, they all turned and waved and said, "Déjà vu, déjà vu," which is, of course, absurd. Now, people can say all kinds of things. They can say, well, this is just the autonomous substructures of the psyche manifesting themselves. But sounds to me like a lawyer's explanation. Yeah.
In light of that, allow me to extend the skeptical line just a bit further. Of your description of the event, is it common to everyone who has participated, to your knowledge? Does it represent 10%, 50%, 75%? Are they equal in description? Do they vary? Is this unique to your description?
All good questions. It's hard to smoke DMT, especially if you're not a smoker. It's harsh. Some people don't get enough. I would say of the people who smoke as much as I think you should smoke, 75% probably report something like this. It's hard for people to report. I mean, I've had years and years of practice. What I've just told you about this is an incredibly crumpled, compressed, edited version. Because what is really happening in there is unspeakably bizarre. Unspeakably bizarre. That seems, in fact, to be its quality, that it is unspeakable. And that, therefore, in order to speak of it, you have to make a leap of faith to this higher-order glossolalia-like language. Ayahuasca is a slow-release DMT if you deconstruct it pharmacologically, so that instead of it happening, DMT, instead of it happening in 4 minutes, it happens over 4 hours. Again, at very high dose ayahuasca and at very high dose psilocybin, these entities begin to emerge. When I take psilocybin, sometime in the second hour, I pass through a place which I've learned to recognize. It's a feeling, and I call it elf country. And there are no elves, but there's a feeling. And then I call them, and following the directions of a favorite episode of I Love Lucy, I call them by saying, "Come in, little green men, come in, little green men." It's simply a permitting. It's simply an invocation. And then they approach like a Newari band from a distance. You can hear the brass and the drum, and as they get closer, and it begins as a sound. It's very interesting. It begins as a sound, and as it gets louder, there comes a point where imperceptibly it becomes visible. And then all I can say is it gets bigger, just like someone marching toward you through three-dimensional space. And so it goes from being a little phenomenon on the horizon of your awareness to you're there, you're with them, you're playing the tuba, you're marching along, it's happening. And then they sort of peel off and march away and leave you in the same way they came. The archetype of this phenomenon, as far as I can tell, is the archetype of the circus. DMT is somehow the cosmic circus. And if you analyze what the circus is, it's a closed environment of permitted outrageousness that roves the straight landscape, setting up in one town and then another and then another. And it's a thing of wonder and light And carny people are loose. They're not like you and me. I remember in the little town I grew up in, every 4th of July, the carnival would come to town for Cherry Day. And we kids were told we couldn't stay out after 9 o'clock when the carnival was in town because there was just this aura. More liquor was being consumed, more people were staying up late, so forth and so on. And if you analyze the circus, it has all the elements of the DMT thing. I mean, there's the center ring, the clowns, and Henry Munn, in a wonderful essay on psilocybin mushrooms called The Mushrooms of Language, describes them as self-performing acrobatic bits of grammar, is how he describes them. This is clearly the same thing. The circus is a wonderful place for children, but it has behind that a dark side. I think my own earliest reminiscence of what I could call erotic awareness. I must have been very, very young, under 3, because I was being held by people. And I was taken to a circus, and there was a woman there in a tiny G-string costume, spinning, hanging by her teeth up near the center, and it was all there. Death and eros and risk and drama, and I got it. So there's all that in the circus, but then there's also the wiggy side, the bearded lady, the goat-faced boy, the thing in the bottle. That's all just off the main event, and then the circus packs up and leaves, and everything is the same except there's some crumpled paper blowing around in the wind. And every little boy and girl worth their salt wants to run off and join the circus. So this is the archetype of DMT, a completely self-contained, transformative world filled with all kinds of implications. It's incredibly mercurial. It's incredibly trickster-like. Yes, it's as though Hermes had divided into 1,000 subalterns, all set going at once. Well, the blooming and buzzing confusion which the infant experiences is the same world we're looking at right now, except that the infant has no language for it. Now, the interesting thing about the DMT thing is you have no language for it. That's interesting point number 1. Interesting point number 2, somebody arrives on the scene eager to provide language. That's suggestive. So it seems like what they're saying is, we've stamped your passport, you're over the border, but no one here speaks English, so if you want to make yourself understood, please pick up the local lingo, Johnny Pronto, and in fact we've assigned a team teaching group. The feeling of the DMT thing, and this is why I entertain the possibility that it might be an anticipation of death. What happens when you smoke DMT is there's an initial kind of handshaking confusion, like when two computers meet and exchange protocols. There's a 30-second period where everything sort of gets sorted out, and this thing forms like a mandala. I call it the chrysanthemum. And it's a rotating orange, yellow, floral, circular, mandalic thing. If you have not taken enough, it is a kind of rubberized membrane or something. If you haven't taken enough, you'll hit it and bounce off and have this really ambiguous experience, which is pretty horrible, actually, just kind of confusion which slowly goes away. But if you've taken enough, and the key to taking enough, and here comes a piece of practical advice that may be worth more than the entire workshop, the way to get off on DMT is after you feel completely peculiar, you have to do one more enormous hit. This is where courage comes in. Most people, they take it and they say, it's working. This stuff feels really weird. It's really working. Say, do one more hit. And they say, no, it's working. Say, no, do one more hit. So then you do, or we say you do. you penetrate that membrane, and you go through a series of, like, to me it's like a ramp, but it's like a series of disystolic compressions that push me forward. Birth canal analogy, obviously. And then I break into the elf dome, or the hive, as I call it. And certain intuitions accompany this without any rationale. And one is, I'm underground. This place is warm, it's domed, it's reasonably well lit, but there's enormous weight above my head. I'm far under the earth somehow. Fairies, as we all know, live under hills. So then I'm there, and the elves and the elf machines and the language lesson are proceeding, but if I can stabilize and calm my hysteria so that I can maintain some kind of objectivity, I notice that really the place I break into is somebody very odd, someone very strange. It's their idea of a reassuring environment for a human being. Somebody who doesn't know very much about human beings, but who's really trying hard, built this terrarium of arrival. And it has the aura of a maternity ward. And I've thought, these self-transforming elf machines, which I take so seriously and try to make the basis for a new ontology, they could be nothing more profound than those plastic shapes that we hang over a baby's bassinet to teach it to coordinate space and color. In other words, what those things are is they're educational toys. They aren't the main clam. They're not in charge of the hospital. They're just something dumped in your arrival playpen to keep you happy while the doctors make the observation. And the doctors never appear. And the whole thing is pervaded with a wonderful affection and zaniness. It's completely life-affirming. I have no patience with alien abduction and any of that. I think that's pathology. I think it's media-damaged people manipulated by incredibly unscrupulous New Age weirdos. There is no paranoia in this. It's entirely positive, although very, very weird. The main thing it is hard to understand. What's this all for, Maybe you thought you were going to have an insight into your relationship or resolve your hatred of your father, and instead you're playing canasta with elves. Yeah.
Is the experience progressive?
Not very. It's always the same. The emphasis is on imitating the language. And
so you don't sense that there's a breakthrough point beyond that? I mean, as you've mentioned, passing through the membrane, getting into this environment, now you're in this environment, the exchange is taking place, you're dealing with it on a rudimentary basis, but you don't have any perception that there's an increase.
Well, the problem is the brevity. We very quickly figured this out back in the 60s. You only get 3 minutes. It's like, visiting the American Museum of Natural History for 3 minutes. So what we really need was an extender. And that was why we went to the Amazon in the first place, was because ayahuasca from the anthropological literature sounded like it was the extender. And in fact, if you brew it stiff enough, it is, and you can get in there for quite a while. But it doesn't become particularly more rationally apprehendable. It's a great mystery. It's a puzzle. It shouldn't exist. It's the thing which you don't believe exists. It does.
Terence, this crazy idea. You're talking about elves. I'm thinking about Santa's. And flying in a sled, and having a red-nosed reindeer, and seeing in the dark, and reindeers eating mushrooms, and so I'm...
Well,
I'm
you,
wondering about these owls that are giving presents.
you want me to extend your list for you? Santa Claus's colors are red and white. Santa Claus is associated with the spruce tree. The spruce tree is the mycorrhizal symbiote of the amanita. The amanita is associated with magical flight. Santa Claus flies. The amanita is associated with reindeer. He flies with the aid of reindeer. He makes gifts for all the boys and girls in the world with the help of elves. Elves, in all traditions, are what are called demon artificers. They make things. That's what elves do. Whether it's shoes or gold jewelry, or they make things. Elves are artificers. Now, what else before I leave this theme? Santa Claus lives at the North Pole. The North Pole is the Axis Mundi, the Yggdrasil, the magic world ash of Norse shamanism grows at the North Pole. You pile all this stuff up and you say, this has got to be an ancient memory of an Amanita cult. Although I've looked at Santa Claus, and I have never found a source that would trace it back further than the 10th century. But I maintain, it's Paleolithic, probably. Yeah.
What's the probability of finding a new tryptamine that we weren't aware of that extends the trip, so to speak? Give one 30 minutes of time to keep the language down. They also might be sort of,
Well, Sasha, is now working on the tryptamines, and I asked him in Mexico, I said, of all of these tryptamines you've elaborated, which ones are the most interesting? I can't remember the one he named, but it was a synthetic, and he said it was extended. There's a certain, I don't know if fear is the word, but these places are really strange. And for most people, 3 minutes is quite enough, and then they need to attempt to assimilate it. Part of the problem is you can't remember it. I mean, I've seen people smoke DMT, give all the presentation of intoxication, come down, lie still, and when you say, what happened? They say, nothing happened, nothing at all happened, and furthermore, I think I won't be seeing too much of you in the future. In fact, I'm sure of it. So,
There's also a possibility of sort of the analog of going to the gym before going out and doing a sports activity, that one practices remembering dreams or trying to experience the weirdest sober things possible in order to have the most stamina in the altered state.
Isn't the dream itself the images of language? I mean, isn't there a form of, aren't your images communicating something to you through images?
you mean in a normal dream?
In a normal dream, there's the citizens of the dream
Yes.
that come, and they, depending upon, whether you're visual or auditory or whatever, they're communicating to you as well. So you're watching, observing and participating and feeling, and you're getting messages at the same time.
Well, and the dream world itself is very bizarre. I have recurrent dreams. A lot of my dreams are recurrent, and I had an experience recently. I was having a recurrent dream, and it was basically I was in a restaurant, and this guy was taking my order, and as I looked at him, I realized I had seen him before in a dream. And I said, I've seen you before, but it's been a long, long time. And he said, yeah, well, I went to Alaska and worked the salmon boats for a while, but now I'm back. It's like, So,
Well, shamans would report that because they're always interacting with the same power sources. That's what they say. They're getting new ones, but they're interacting with the power sources.
That's right, yeah.
When you're talking about the images that you're describing this, what happens to my understanding is it sounds like these are the keepers of the patterns of life, in a sense. They're the keepers of the DNA, or when something comes into life, a species or a species exits life, that there is a gathering up of the patterns. And if the life itself, we don't understand that realm or that form, but maybe in this altered state that we get to go into and see what it's like to gather up patterns and in a sense illustrate to us how the patterns, because it's kind of like it's a joyous thing, life in itself, and that the keepers would be something that would be.
Well, imagine how astonishing it would be if we could confirm that there was something beyond death, and that in fact it was not only there was something, but whatever this something was actually looking back at us. I was raised Catholic and took a lot of time to deconstruct this kind of stuff. It did not seem to me rationally supportable. But actually that's in the light of a fairly simple rationalism. Now I look at nature, and everywhere what I see is that nature conserves novelty. This is something you'll hear me say many times. In other words, once nature achieves some structure, she is very reluctant to let it go. Life is an example. Life was achieved more than 1 billion years ago. And through asteroid cataclysm and polar reverse and solar dynamic, it is tenaciously held on. So it may be that this thing which we call the personality, the self, is actually of interest to nature as a complex structure, and that it really does use the physical body as a kind of workbench upon which to build a higher dimensional vehicle of some sort. Otherwise, it's very hard to account for some of what's going on. And this is one of the most confounding ideas that you could put forth in this intellectual environment, because if there's one thing that science has definitely put some effort into, it's exercising spirit from nature. Nature is a soulless machine, according to science, without purpose, without intent, without will, without sentience. It's just happening. It's mutation grinding against natural selection, and that's all it is, according to them. Well, evidence from these shamanic dimensions seems to be quite the contrary. By the way, this is what I intended to talk about this afternoon. I was not led astray. My notion of this afternoon was that what we would talk about is the various characteristics of novelty. This morning we talked about the methods, then, the various characteristics of novelty, and DMT represents a concrescence of novelty. It is the paradigmatic psychedelic, it's the paradigmatic dimension transiting experience. Other descents into novelty are your own maturation, your individual experience of life. Hopefully, if you're getting older, you're getting smarter. There's no excuse for anything else. How would it be if it worked the other way? Although for some people, they seem to manage that. So life, your life, is a descent into novelty as well. Leading, all these novel paths lead to the same door, marked post-mortem. History is another descent into novelty, and now that descent is proceeding at such a pace that we can almost physically feel ourselves moving into the future. I mean, we require daily newspapers and hourly updates to stay on the moving crest of what we have set loose. So the individual journey through life toward death, the cultural journey toward transcendence, eschatology, apocalypse, whatever it is, depending on the cultural style, and then fractally embedded in these larger forms of novelty, the psychedelic experience, and, in the spirit of thoroughness, the sexual experience, which against the background of ordinary life and activity, definitely represents a nexus of novelty and focus. So all of these things are descents into novelty, and then I maintain on a still more micro scale this period of time we're experiencing between the end of February and midsummer, a similar thing, that these patterns repeat, and sometimes they're extremely dramatic. I suppose death itself being the most dramatic example, because basically that's the trip from which you do not return, and so forth.
You're aware that Friday was the biggest single change in financial markets in the last 7 years?
No, I flew Thursday. What happened Friday?
Well, the stock market lost 180 points. The bond market had a disastrous, you know what bonds fell?
Yield increased a quarter.
The market fell how far?
180 points.
On Friday. Well, they must be shitting white over the weekend. What's going to happen Monday morning?
Right, Monday's a big day.
Well, I win! Not that the stock market is the revelation of God's holy will for mankind, but notice that what is interesting about the stock market, even if you don't give a hoot about money or capitalism, is that it's an effort to mass average change. It's an effort to give you a very large-scale picture of many, many opinions brought into a final recension of some sort. So in a way, it is like the time wave.
It is, and just to further your thought, a great article in The Economist from last week, International Magazine of Finance, that put a statistical correlation now on all of the world's markets becoming interlocked. All the big developed country markets are not acting independently of each other as they used to. The rubber band force is becoming much tighter.
Well, see, if they would study dynamics, this wouldn't puzzle them at all. That's a well-known phenomenon in dynamics. It's called coupled oscillation. The simplest example being walk into a Swiss cuckoo shop, and all the cuckoo clocks hanging on the wall, the pendulums are swinging in unison. That's not because the guy spent hours setting the cuckoo clocks. It's because hanging them on the wall, they actually communicate their vibrations to each other through the wall, and after a few hours of running at all kinds of different speeds, everything falls into step. Coupled oscillation. Women in dormitories, their menstruation falls into phase. That's a coupled biological oscillator. And you get this in many, many systems. And the problem with it is, in something like a stock market situation, is it then tends to amplify small perturbations into very large perturbations. And the entire system then tends to destabilize. Well, that's very interesting. Next week could be major. The way the descent into novelty will work is there's no earth-shaking moment. For many months preceding the 25th of February, we'll look at this tonight, but for many months preceding the 25th of February, things have become more and more locked, conservative, recidivist, whatever you want to call it, habitual, traditional, repetitious. Then the cusp was the 25th of February. Well, but you don't feel the earth move. The 26th is not greatly different from the 25th. The 27th is slightly more different. The 28th still slightly more. But over the next 2 months, every day will mark a greater descent into novelty. And as I say, a worldwide economic collapse would certainly precipitate all kinds of other changes. And there's plenty of instability in the system. And the Chinese are playing with the idea of world war, or at least their military are, while the political people are busy dying. Once you get the internationalist rhetoric out of Marxism, what you have is National Socialism. So it isn't communists that are about to return to power in Russia. It's National Socialism that's about to take power in Russia. That's a terrifying possibility. And then, of course, as I said, the unexpected, which can be anything from asteroid strike to technical innovation to Ebola outbreak to political assassination. These things are, you can bet on the unexpected. It's the safest bet on the table. Yeah.
The curious thing for me, again, going back to millenarianism, is in a sense the construct is an abstraction. We are not reaching the year 2000, in essence, means nothing. It is the energy that we bring to it that, in a sense, creates the atmosphere for the events to take place.
Well, you mean that that the year 2000 is no different from any other year?
Exactly.
Well, except that if you look at the way society frames its values, one of the largest value frames that we have, perhaps arguably the largest, is the calendar. And so once you accept a calendar, then its rhythms become automatic. And so here we are facing the turn of 1,000 years, which, you're right, in and of itself, it's nothing, but because we are psychologically driven by it, it becomes something. You can hear these politicians, if they have no rhetoric, they just use the calendar itself as a rhetorical launching pad and try to make that seem like progress. Here's a progressive program. We'll turn the millennium. Well, we're going to turn the millennium, and whether it's progressive or not. There will be a lot of Christian hysteria as we approach the millennium, because it's not only, it's their last chance. I mean, I don't think anybody believes that in 3000, Christianity will be making a major push. This is their last chance to deliver, and they are very confident of the delivery, and so there is a spreading hysteria. And of course, whenever society becomes incomprehensible, people assume that the end is near. And that seems to attend that spreading social confusion. Millenarianism is inevitably, well, not inevitably, but largely a phenomenon of the displaced, the economically desperate, and so forth. Yeah.
What do you think is going to happen? Is there going to be another nativistic movement, or a large cargo cult? I mean, what's going to happen?
You mean over the next 10 years or so?
Pat Buchanan.
I don't think so. I think Pat Buchanan is discovering the world is even more novel than he supposed. If you've never won and you win, that's novel. But now it's time to win again, and it's no longer novel. You're back with the problem you had before you won the first time. I'm very hopeful, because as I look at large scales of time, I see that what has always been conserved is greater richness of opportunity, greater freedom. And the way I define the ultimate omega point of novelty is it must be the place where all things become possible. How could it not be that? Because that's what novelty means, is strange things being possible. Well, when all strange things are possible, you've met the novelty maxima. Well, how could such a place exist? Well, it couldn't unless you move into hyperspace, or if you invent time travel, or something like that. Then you break the forward momentum of linear history. But that's conceivable. I mean, there's no reason intrinsically why time travel is impossible. And time travel is simply a Romana clef for transformation of energy and matter on all scales. Time travel is faster than light travel. These things all become the same thing. And there is no reason why these things can't be anticipated. You know, the whole purpose of data coordination, whether it's occurring in an amoeba or a mega international corporation. The purpose of data coordination is to predict the future, always. I mean, that's what your senses do for you. You know, notice when you look over there and decide to walk over there, you're also deciding to walk over then. In other words, you are coordinating data to move through time and space toward a future point. And the whole evolution of life, on one level, can be seen as a conquest of dimensions. You know, the earliest forms of life were fixed slimes of some sort. And then motility, motion became a possibility, but just basically groping in a linear line, unable to see what is ahead of you, unable to see what you've just left, but groping. Well, then over time and through evolution, light-sensitive chemicals get sequestered on the surface of these organisms. And now they have a gradient that tells them where light is, and they can go toward it or away from it. They are gaining dimensional sophistication. Well, from that point to the evolution of human beings, it's basically evolution works on one theme: the developing of better bodies for the conquest of three-dimensional space. So the fin turns into the leg and so forth and so on. And then finally that's like fulfilled in higher animals. You know, the cheetah can run 70 miles an hour and so forth and so on. These are the limits of flesh are achieved. But then at that point, mind begins to flex its muscle and move forward. And what is language but the ability to recreate the past in the present, or to recreate the hypothetical in the present? In other words, in a world without language, experience is always being lost. You have it and then it goes away. If you can talk about it around the campfire and tell the stories, then the past stays with you. And the ancestors accompany you on your journey through time. Well, then if you get still more sophisticated and begin to write, now not only the great myths, the enduring triumphs and tragedies of your group can be kept, but all the minutiae, the tax records, the tallies of crops bought and sold, the king lists, everything can be. And now, you know, through the transformation of media electronically, we essentially, the past is a file in our world, and the file is more and more, you know, once we have VR, much of the past will stay around as an adjunct to the present. On the other end of that equation, we have developed incredibly powerful mathematical tools for predicting and extending data into the future. It's terribly, terribly important. The stock market is a good example. I mean, we need to know how these markets operate in order to avoid social confusion and breakdown of social systems. Inventory theory is a place where, you know, you need to know 6 weeks, 10 weeks out where you're going to be, because if you're warehousing a lot of stuff, you're losing money. If you can refine your predictive understanding of how your market operates, you can save a lot of money. You can save and make money by predicting the future. This has not been lost on anybody. And so there's a great deal of interest in doing this. Well, if this is a valid program of research, then its holy grail would obviously be as complete a prediction of the future as is feasible. And I think, you know, the time wave and catastrophe theory and complexity theory and these things are new techniques and new styles of trying to approach that ideal. Yeah.
What constitutes something that clues you in and say, wait, that was a novel, or that typifies novelty? Because things that I've been hearing about so far have to do with like presidential elections or stock market crashes. None of that seems to be novel to me.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Novelty, I think I may have mentioned this, but it's worth discussing. Novelty should never occur without its ghost concept accompanying it, which is its opposite, which is habit. In my version of how the universe works, it's a struggle between these two forces, habit and novelty. And in a period of 1,000,000 years, there's a way to draw the picture of the battle. And in the last 10 minutes, there's a way to draw the picture of the battle. So what is habit? Habit is repetition of activities already accomplished. Repetition is habit. Tradition is habit. Limited risk-taking is habit. I think you get the idea. Novelty, on the other hand, is high risk, new, untried, strange, unusual, stands out from the surrounding environment, and surprises. So against God's intercession into history, Pat Buchanan's win in New Hampshire may not appear to be greatly novel, but that's not the correct scale of comparison. The correct scale of comparison was the expectation that he would lose. You see, so habit and novelty occur in the most sublime and mundane dimensions because they're relative terms. They're always measured against their surround, so that, if you're in some incredibly constipated, ritual-dominated society, and you so much as put a spot of paint on your toenail, social ripples go out from this. It has to be explained, defended. What does this mean? Who does it challenge? It's a novel act against the background of such constipated expectations. On the other hand, there are societies where full-body elective surgery won't even get a ripple from your gang when you show up at the coffee house. So that's an area where the standards of novelty and habit are different. Over large scales of time, it seems very clear to me that the story of our universe is novelty is winning. Novelty is winning. It's a very slow battle of attrition because habit is so reluctant to give ground and will take ground back. But over large scales of time, novelty is winning. That's where we come into the picture. That's why there's life on this planet. That's why there's people on this planet. That's why there's high technology on this planet, because novelty is winning. That's one point. The other point is it's winning faster and faster. It isn't simply proceeding at the same pace. What happens in a 10-year period now is orders of magnitude more connections being made than were made in a 10 or 1,000 or perhaps million-year period at times in the past. And all time is the connections, the events which fill it. In other words, if you think of 1,000,000 years in absolutely empty space, and ask what's it like to experience 1,000,000 years in absolutely empty space, it passes in an instant because nothing happened. If nothing happened, then there was no time. Time is defined by the events which fill it. If there are no events, time collapses into nothingness. A universe in which nothing happens is a universe that has no duration.
So you need duality to have time.
Yeah. It's an illusion of a lower dimensional slice of reality.
You need duality. Is it a priori, like Kant said?
Is the dualism a priori?
Time.
It's given if that's what you mean by a priori. It's a real thing, and by that, I mean, we could argue what that means, but it's a real thing in the same way that space, time, and space, gravitation, and energy are real things. It's not a construct of the human mind.